Contrary to what many Calvinists claim, there is no biblical reason to suggest that 1 Timothy 2, verse 4, in any way limits the number of people whom God desires to save. 1 Timothy chapter 2 begins with these words from the Apostle Paul. For I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men. And then immediately after, as kind of a parenthetical side note, Paul then lists a group or category of men. A category of men who would not typically be at the top of the list at the church prayer meeting. He says in verse 2, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. In responding to Roger Olson's new book titled Against Calvinism, James White in his blog at Alpha and Omega Ministries takes issue with Olson's mentioning and references of 1 Timothy 2, verse 4. In his blog he states, it is actually absurd to think that Paul was exhorting Timothy to pray for every person without limit when he said that prayer should be made for all men. White continues, if Paul expected Timothy to take all men in verse 1 as meaning every person without limit, then why did he immediately place a categorical limitation on his words? There is no categorical limitation at all. What Calvinists fail to recognize is that even if Paul has in mind various categories or kinds or groups of men when he mentions kings and all who are in authority, which is debatable, by simply listing various categories of men, he is by no means limiting the number of people to pray for within a category. You see, there's a big difference between saying that this category of men should receive our prayers, as kings and all those in authority in Paul's time would not have been so fondly looked upon, and then limiting the number of individuals within a category, which the text never does. Paul continues in verses 3 and 4, for this is acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. Calvinists insist that Paul is conveying that God desires the salvation of all kinds of men without distinction, just as prayer should be made for all kinds of men. Even if so, wouldn't all kinds of men, as long as we're not limiting individuals within a category, encompass every living man? Wouldn't all kinds of men simply be an elaboration or another way of stating all men without exception? But to be clear, according to the Calvinistic understanding of unconditional election, God desires the salvation of only some within all the different kinds of men. Where is that notion in the text? Calvinists constantly harp that the context of 1 Timothy 2 is all kinds of men without distinction. But even if this was the case, which is debatable, so what? As long as we're not limiting individuals within a category, all kinds of men is equivalent to all men without exception. The only way for their view to ring true in this chapter is if Paul had clearly communicated that only some within a category, kind, or group should be prayed for, and that God desires the salvation of only some within a category, kind, or group. Of course, the text says nothing of the sort, and it's precisely why, in my opinion, that Roger Olson, in his new book Against Calvinism, could state that 1 Timothy 2, verse 4, cannot be interpreted any other way as referring to every person without limit.